Please be seated. Professor Crowther actually suggested that the opening music should be "We Are the Champions" for Professor Gradidge today. Good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you here tonight. My name is Professor Garth Stevens. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for People Development and Culture, and it's truly a pleasure to be with you all this evening at this inaugural lecture by Professor Philippe Gradidge from the Department of Exercise Science and Sports Medicine in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Professor Gradidge, I know you asked that I open your water, but somebody else has opened your water for you already here, right? Let me take this opportunity to formally acknowledge all of you here this evening, present and online, on behalf of Wits University, as members of the university community, as colleagues, as students, as friends, and as family members of our inaugurating professor. I would like to acknowledge the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Shabir Mahdi, who is unfortunately unable to be with us this evening, but also the Acting Dean, and also the Head of School, Professor Helen Miezwa, Professor Nigel Crowther, who will be doing the vote of thanks this evening, and of course a very, very special welcome to our inaugurating professor, Professor Gradidge. We're not quite sure what you've done with your leg there, Professor Gradidge, but I'm sure you're going to regale us with some tale this evening, yes? Colleagues, friends, tonight is really a moment when the university formally acknowledges and very publicly acknowledges the personal achievements of a scholar as he or she attains the highest rank of the academy within the university. And that, of course, is the apex rank of the full professor. This is really an opportunity for us to acknowledge your achievements this evening, not only in the university, but also in the broader public domain. And so the inaugural lecture is open to any member of the public to share in the knowledge and the scholarship of the inaugurating professor. This has been its tradition. But this is also a moment in which we can acknowledge very, very loudly again that this achievement is never purely about the inaugurating professor. It is also reflective of an immense amount of investment, support, mentorship, sacrifice, and care that has been shown by so many colleagues, collaborators, family members, and friends. And so we use this opportunity to collectively share in this moment with you, to celebrate with a communal sense of pride with you in the achievement that one of our own has attained. And of course, we look forward, Professor Gradidge, to celebrating with you and experiencing your thoughts and insights this evening. The inaugural lecture normally involves a full professor sharing with colleagues and the broader public their body of work or the future of their work or a combination of these. So even though it brings with it a sense of anticipation, sometimes a little bit of anxiety as well for the inaugurating professor, in many instances, I do want you to remember, Professor Gradidge, that everybody who's here tonight, they're here because they actually want to be here, and they're here because they are supportive of you. So enjoy it as a celebratory event. And don't think of it as a hazing of sorts, right? A coming out of sorts. So without belaboring my opening remarks, let me formally call on the Acting Dean and the Head of School, Professor Helen Miezwa, to introduce our inaugurating professor. Over to you, Professor Miezwa.
Good evening, everybody. I promise not to drink your water. I think I'm more nervous about introducing Professor Philippe Gradidge because I'm recalling one of the first days that I saw him start his academic journey at a writing retreat. And I recognize some of the faces who were present at that writing retreat. But I promise you I'll say no more. Let me introduce Professor Philippe Gradidge, who is a researcher and chair of our Research and Postgraduate Studies Committee in the School of Therapeutic Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand. With a PhD, his research focuses on the epidemiology of obesity and cardiometabolic diseases, particularly among African women, and the role of lifestyle behaviors in disease prevention. Over the past decade, Professor Gradidge has published extensively with over 60 peer-reviewed articles and numerous first author contributions. His work has been featured in many international collaboration efforts and has informed policy briefs on physical activity and health in Africa. He has supervised more than 100 postgraduate students and is actively involved in capacity building for emerging researchers. Professor Gradidge has received multiple awards. He has a C3 NRF rating and international grants from across the world, including France, UK, USA, and South Africa itself. He serves on editorial boards, scientific committees, and is a recognized voice in science communication, regularly contributing to media and public health discourse. His commitment to interdisciplinary research, curriculum innovation, and public engagement exemplifies academic citizenship. Today's lecture marks a significant milestone in a career dedicated to advancing health, equity, and research excellence in South Africa, at our university as well, and beyond. And I would like to say that Professor Gradidge does this always with a smile. And he's one of the calmest people that we have, and I appreciate that you're here. Welcome, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mayeswa, and thank you to Professor Garth-Stephens, representing senior management in the university. And also thanks to Professor Crowther, who looks more nervous than I do. So there is a story behind this, and I'm not going to tell it right now. But as you can see, movement does matter, and it matters for me, because I've gone from riding 300 kilometers a week and more to nothing. And so I'm really grateful and I'm honored to be here. As Professor Stephens introduced me, I am in the Department of Exercise Science and Sports Medicine, which, for those that don't know, is in the School of Therapeutic Sciences in the Faculty of Health Sciences. So what if I told you that the most powerful medicine doesn't come in a bottle, it comes in movement? Let's begin with a voice, and this is from data that we collected in the field. Some women, when they go home, they do everything. And guys, it's not a reflection of my wife and me. They do the dishes, cooking, cleaning, while the husband sits. And it adds to her stress. So this makes me think about women's unpaid physical labor, which is not really captured in the tools that we have at hand now. We've got self-reported tools. We've got tools that we wear on our wrist that collect everyday movement. It collects our sleep patterns, etc. But it misses this. It misses the movement that we do every day. And in fact, World Health Organization tracks measurements, but focuses predominantly on leisure time physical activity. This brings me to some deeper questions. So what does rest look like for women who never stop moving? How can we reframe movement to include dignity and agency? Is walking to work or commuting, cleaning and caregiving considered as physical activity? Why do we ignore daily movement? Is physical inactivity always a choice, or is it shaped by invisible burdens? And this is the structure or outline of the talk, moving from evidence to action. I'll talk about some data, and obviously I can't talk about the 70, 80 plus papers and policy briefs that I've been involved with. This is a curated version of the work that I'm I've been involved with and continue to be involved with. But it goes from the data, looking at behavior, the context that we all live in, and how policy converges into meaningful impact. But before we dive into the data, it's important to acknowledge the people that shared this journey with me. And those include colleagues, friends, mostly cycling friends that I haven't been connected with for the past 3 weeks. The university itself. I'll kick off with my parents and my in-laws were in the audience. My dad was very generous with his time. He's a good listener. My mum was faith, stood strong and stands strong. My mother-in-law, Jane, who's there in the audience, who's actually the most active on our WhatsApp group. And my father-in-law, Joe, who actually has a strong connection to WITS. In fact, he was instrumental in funding the WITS Donald Gordon and sat on the WITS Health Consortium's board for a number of years. My extended family were also in the audience, my cycling friends, for shared lunches, lots of coffees and teas, and of course, cake. My head of school and former heads of school, Judy, where are you? Judy, thank you for sharing this journey with me, for advising me. Often had to say, Philippe, this is not the time. Wait. Wait and build it up, it'll come, your time will come. I appreciate you putting the brakes on me, and when the time was right, people didn't question, and then that led to promotions along the way, which I'll touch on a little bit later. My head of school, sitting over there, Professor Torres, for listening, for leading the department. We've connected as colleagues. She's now my line manager, and she's very recently taken on a fractional role leading the WITS Zylstra complex. I wish you all the best. Dimitri, sitting right next to her, my former HOD, and we've shared many couches together, many coffees. We've flown across the world, we've traveled locally, we've connected. He's been a mentor, and I appreciate all that you guys have done. Professor Crowther, thank you. We've known each other since 2011. It was a bit of a relationship where one was behind the desk, the other one was on the other side of the desk, which seemed distance. That fell away shortly after I received my PhD. And we've become friends since then. We've also kept connected as friends, connected over meals. Sometimes it included beverages. And I'd like to formally thank you, Nigel, for being there. We still do a lot of work together. We bounce ideas back and forth. Sometimes we go ahead with those ideas, and sometimes we scrap them. That's the thing. We've got a lot of things that we still, I think will keep us busy for the rest of our lives. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, and some of them are here today in the department. Colleagues that I work with, locally and abroad. Professor Stevens, did you see Professor Baumann seated? It's actually the best parts that I could find of him. But I'd like to mention him because he's been instrumental in opening doors. He's put me at the table so that people know who I am and they appreciate my ideas at senior level. I'd particularly like to, and Glenda Gray is in the audience, and I'd like to mention Glenda, who had invited me to something that I had not been invited to. I said, Glenda, do you know that I was not formally invited to this? She said, Philippe, I'm inviting you. And I chatted with her afterwards in the car park, and I said, Glenda, what's this about? I wasn't meant to be here. And Glenda said, the idea of going through life not holding on to what you have, but being generous. And that includes the time, your networks, and connecting with people. So Glenda, I appreciate you for doing that, and I appreciate you again for being here. I'd like to thank my kids, 3 amazing kids, Luke, Bella, and Judah. Thank you for filling our lives with joy, laughter, and shared moments. Actually, remember when we were together playing Piggy in the Middle, and Dad happened to fall? We shared that moment together, and actually went from time of joy and laughter to extreme pain. And lastly, I'd like to thank my wife, who's been a woman of noble character, my constant source of strength, wisdom, and love. And as was mentioned by Professor Mayeso earlier, we met at Wits Rural. There are a number of us in the room that we traveled to Wits Rural, and our relationships have been strong. And my particular relationship with Kathy has grown from strength to strength. Thank you for being my support, my anchor, and of course, my personal nurse. My journey is much like yours. It's atypical, but I'll shift all the way to 2009 when it began with Dimitri opening a door to me and saying, Philippe, you're welcome into the center as a part-time lecturer. And shortly after that, I received my master's, my PhD in 2016, and in 2020, I completed the clinical exercise physiology exam and luckily passed. So it's gone from being a lecturer, convinced I'd changed the world, once Dimitri showed me how to use the projector, to being a senior lecturer, teaching, research, admin, and does anyone know where I left my staff card? To being an associate professor, mentoring others while secretly Googling how to write a grant application and budget. In 2024, being promoted to personal professor, climbed another mountain with access to ChatGPT, and of course, Copilot. So now let's turn to the evidence. And this is a conceptual framework that Nigel, Shane, and I put together when I started my PhD in 2011. Down in that little corner is an idea around physical activity. And that's how I stepped into the room. I said to Nigel and Shane, I'm the physical activity guy. And they said, Philippe, that is such a small portion of the bigger picture. Go back, do your homework, and come back with a conceptual framework. And this is what we agreed on. And so at the end of the PhD, we confirmed that cardiometabolic disease is not linear. It's complex. It's interconnected. We found that waist circumference, which is an indicator of central adiposity, is a strong marker. It's the strongest marker for cardiometabolic disease in African women. We found that physical activity protects against disease. Sitting time was associated with high cholesterol, blood pressure, high blood pressure, and an increase in adiposity over time. We also found that body image shapes weight gain. So it's important to consider. It's important to consider that adipose tissue is not inert. It's an active endocrine organ releasing hormones. So we focus on adiponectin, which is a hormone released by adipose tissue, and found that it increases with body fat. But our data shows that it's protective against metabolic syndrome, which is a clustering pathology, clustering disease. We also found that age and smoking was associated with sarcopenia and cardiometabolic disease. And so this framework shows the bigger picture, that the interconnection between biology, socioeconomic status, and context, and not just the numbers. So this comes from a structural equation model that we had put together, looking at how socioeconomic status at baseline impacts cardiometabolic disease and fat over a 10-year period. And we challenge the assumption that high socioeconomic status means better health. So we show that socioeconomic status is associated with poorer movement and higher sitting time, so less physical activity, higher sitting time, and an increase in adiposity over time. So more doesn't always equal better health. It sometimes means having more sitting time. So let's look at the definitions very quickly. So the World Health Organization at present still focuses on BMI as a cutoff. So BMI, a body mass index, so it's your height in relation to your weight squared, of 30 indicates that a person has overall obesity. And then later, this year, the Lancet Commission challenged that definition and said that obesity is a chronic relapsing disease of excess dysfunctional adiposity that impairs health. So BMI is insufficient as a sole diagnostic tool. If we look at the South African editorial that was published earlier this year, it aligns with the WHO, but frames obesity as a chronic condition with systemic health and economic consequences. In South Africa, the level of obesity is particularly high in women. So 4 out of 10 women are obese at present, and that's likely to increase to 50%. So the projections are really, really high. And that's why I focus on women in this particular talk. So numbers represent a public health signal, an urgency to address. And this particular slide refers to data that we collected in Senegal. And I pulled out a quote from a woman that's based in an urban setting in Senegal. And so she reflected that women intentionally use medication in the past, in urban areas, to gain weight, while in rural areas, being larger was seen as being less productive. So you're not able to do the work. And that has shifted and still shifting over time. We see that happening in South Africa as well as the data that we pulled in Soweto. So, and these perceptions shape culture, and it's important to consider when we design interventions. So building on the cultural insight that we found that we collected in Senegal, and this is work that I co-published with Emmanuel Cohen, that I still do work with. And we looked at data from women in Senegal and Cameroon, and men and women, but for the purpose of this talk, a focus on women. And it looked at their somatotypes and what they see themselves as, either endomorph, which refers to a curvier shape, ectomorph, which refers to a leaner or thinner shape, or mesomorph, which refers to a more muscular body shape. And the goal of this particular project was to create something that's relevant for the African region, because up to that point, we were using tools that had been designed in the West. So using Eurocentric or data or tools that were developed in America. So if we zoom in on the segment that where most of the data are concentrated, this shows the means of somatotypes and shows diversity rather than uniformity in how people see themselves. And so the red dots refer to the different regions. So we used these profiles, we collapsed the two, and created a validated tool, which we called the body shape scale for African settings. And in fact, we're busy with the tool now and applying it in the field, collecting data in the field, and we're busy with writing up those results. And so it's important, so when we consider movement, not to only consider it in isolation, we need to consider that what do the people see themselves as? And that can change over time, and it can change depending on the setting that you actually live in. So building on that idea and following the development of the body shape scale, we tested its performance. And Prof. Stevens, this was before the likes of Benji Rosman and Adam Pantanovitz became famous, and before AI was the big thing. So Nigel and Emmanuel and I approached them in 2017, Nigel? And we said, so we've got this data, we've got these photographs, can we do something together? And they said, of course we can, we've been doing this for ages. So they came up with the idea of using convolutional neural networks, which is a type of deep learning, and to figure out if we can take photographs and develop a method that is scalable in low and middle income countries by simply taking a photo of someone using mobile technology in the field. And so it came up as 93% accurate, which means that you can simply take a photo, and obviously there are privacy concerns around this, and from the photograph, you can estimate a person's risk of disease, current and future disease. But before we ask women to change their body shapes, and obviously you need to be careful, this is a touchy space, we need to understand how they see themselves. So we asked this question in Soweto: which one of these body shape silhouettes or images looks the most like you? And which one of the body shape or body image silhouettes do you want to look like? Why does it matter? Because we found in our earlier data that your body shape, the way you see yourself, influences your behavior, and that can include how much exercise you do, how much sitting you participate in on a daily basis. So we performed a longitudinal study, and this is how it performed. So 57%, or so 2/3 of the population, saw themselves as wanting to be leaner. And in fact, if you look at the body mass index, that they had the highest BMIs, which indicated that they were actually obese, in the obese category, and they wanted to be thinner. And women that wanted to be thinner, so they also had the highest adiposity over time. And when I speak to time, I speak of a 10-year period. The other thing to note in the data are that 74% saw themselves as underestimating their body weight. So when women who underestimated their body weights had higher BMI and fat mass over time. So here we see the data, and we also see that people that were content, their body weight did not change over time. It's also important to note that people that accurately perceived their body weight gained more fat than those that underestimated their body weight over time. And what we picked up in multilinear regression analyses was that vigorous physical activity, a high amount of physical activity, was associated with less fat gain over time, indicating that physical activity can protect against disease or fat, an increase in fat, despite you perceiving yourself as being, despite you incorrectly perceiving yourself. This is data that comes from Soweto, where we assessed 977 Black South African women with a mean age of 41. The findings are striking. So 67% were seen or reported as being physically active, and yet 48% were obese, 40% had metabolic syndrome. Owning a car, which is something that every one of us, or most of us in this room have, or we use public transport, drove higher cholesterol and increased blood pressure, systolic and diastolic blood pressures. But on a positive note, a higher amount of physical activity was associated with a lower amount of fasting insulin, which is a marker of metabolic health. Therefore, leisure physical activity, as you see, so most of them did walking. So walking as a form of active transport, leisure physical activity alone is not enough. So we must tackle sedentary behavior, which was high in this population, even among the physically active. So of note that sitting, and a lot of the evidence is showing, is on par or even worse than smoking as a disease in terms of cardiometabolic risk. And this data on this slide refers to an African population in the workplace. So they were employed. And so they had high amount of sitting. They were sitting at work for over 3 hours, at least 3 hours per day. And yet 76% saw themselves as physically active. Found no strong links between the amount of sitting and disease markers. But here's the insight. Low physical activity or light physical activity was associated with a drop in blood pressure over time. So, which means that even small amounts of physical activity can be helpful. So let me put it in another way. So even if you get up and you make a coffee, or you get up and you chat to your colleague instead of emailing them, it has positive implications in terms of your own health. So sometimes in our own department, we've had walking meetings, which has been sometimes more fruitful than having a meeting around the table. Maggie, you're in the room. This is data that Maggie helped to collect. And we tracked 87 workers with accelerometry using wrist-worn monitors. We showed that sitting time was associated with high sickness absence, so staying away from work. And staying away from work, maybe it's not because of your own sickness, but maybe you're caring for your kids and you need to take them to the clinic. Associated with depression, likewise, body mass index was associated with these two outcomes, while vigorous physical activity was seen as protective. This is data in this slide that Merlin Paswana helped, or actually you collected all the data, Merlin. Merlin collected all this data from a rural village in Limpopo, and this is actually a village that Merlin actually grew up in, which makes me think that there's a sense of ownership around that data. And I often say this to the students, don't just work with retrospective data, because you're only working with the numbers. In fact, in my experience, you gain the most by collecting the data yourself. And when it came to analyzing the data, which is something that myself and Nigel had to do, I didn't just see numbers. I could picture the people. It's weird, but I could picture the people. I recall collecting the data on individual people. And so going forward, that's something that I would say to PhDs, masters, and postgrads, and postdocs as well. Get into the field, get your hands dirty, get a sense of interacting with the people. And in this particular population, again, we see a high percentage, high prevalence of obesity, hypertension. The obesity is associated with poorer outcomes, and that high, and weirdly, and it's actually what we saw, that high socioeconomic status was associated with a higher amount of obesity and higher central adiposity. We also saw, and this was something novel for this particular population, we looked at sugar-sweetened beverages, and we used PCAs, which is kind of complicated, but we grouped it into categories, and we found that if you drink more sugar-sweetened beverages, and actually, in fact, it focused on sweetened tea in combination with alcohol consumption, and in particular beer, that was associated with a higher amount of body mass index. So this indicates that there are obvious dietary shifts. We need to address those in conjunction with addressing physical activity as well. And the one thing I need to mention, that completion of high school, which is an indicator of education, better education, was associated with a drop in waist circumference. And this means that when we address lifestyle, we need to consider education, the economic context, and not just the clinical markers or the numbers. So Nigel and I published a review article just reflecting on the metabolic syndrome cutoff. And this really just allows us to pause and reflect that we need to look at the metabolic syndrome differently in an African setting. Waist circumference, using Eurocentric data, is a lot higher, but emerging evidence has shown that we need to address this waist circumference cutoff of 80 centimeters, which is a lot higher, and it's closer to a male's waist circumference cutoff. But essentially, it's this metabolic syndrome, which is it's a clustering disease, where if you have at least 3 of these diseases, you would be classified as having metabolic syndrome. And I'll speak to that later, in the African population, it's very, very high. And so in this population, Soweto, just under 50%, so 49.6% were classified as having metabolic syndrome. And this is alarming, but what's more alarming is that 27% had HIV and addressed with medication. So we also see that there's an intersection between non-communicable diseases and communicable diseases. And going forward, we need to look at that intersection a little bit deeper. It's something that maybe we can look at together, Glenda, so some of the work that you're doing in your space, and work that Professor Helen Rees is doing as well in the city. So this data just highlights the problem in the African region, and that 37% of all deaths can be directly related to non-communicable diseases, specifically hypertension, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. Okay. So it's worth mentioning, at a meeting in 2025, so that they say that obesity is largely preventable. Guys, we've known this for many, many years, but they're still saying the same thing. I'll mention it later. There was another meeting where the guys met together and highlighted that obesity is a problem and that we need to address the problem. But it's still there. And so we need to target physical activity, because in South Africa, as shown on this slide, we have the highest level of physical insufficiency globally. And if we look at projections, it's likely to increase. So the gap is widening. It's something that we need to interrupt immediately. But I asked the question, and I asked it earlier, are we measuring it correctly and fairly? Not everyone has access to a wristwatch. Not everyone has access to the tool. And most people are not reachable. The World Health Organization focuses on addressing this by doing 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity, or 75 or 150 minutes of vigorous physical activity, or a combination of both per week. But again, I mean, this is work that Tessa Strain has published. But again, are we capturing the intermittent or the small movement that one does in our day to day? Because I chatted with Tessa about this, and in fact, in the region, they're using old data from the South African region. So it's questionable around the predictions. It's based on old data. So we need to go out in the field, collect the data, and obviously use objective data. So like if we do have access to wrist-worn monitors, use it. If we don't, simply use, for example, the physical activity vital sign, which I just asked 2 questions around your physical activity. How much physical activity did you do in the week? So it's reflecting on the recent week. And how much effort did you put into it? So it's an idea of, in that week, how much moderate to vigorous physical activity. And we can use that as a proxy measure of physical activity for that individual or community. And then we can start addressing physical activity in those respective communities. In fact, Pedro Halal and Andrea Varela, and 2 people that I work with now at an international level, questioned this in an editorial following that paper that was published. They said, well, you're not collecting the data properly. What about the unpaid movement? What about child labor? That, in this day and age is still the idea of slave labor, but it's physical activity. It's physically demanding, but it's not collected. So our metrics aren't reflected properly, and there's still a focus on leisure time physical activity at a global level. And so I asked the question, how is physical activity perceived and experienced in our own context? So I put together just some examples of qualitative data that were pulled from the field in different studies. They, as in a community healthcare worker, and this is something that Georgia Torres and I were involved with, the community health worker said, I must exercise. And I said to them, but as I'm cleaning, I'm already exercising. So the participants actually knew more than the community healthcare worker. It's almost the same. 2 hours one way, coming here. 2 hours walking, guys. I do have a little walk to the bus stop. I walk from one office to another, but most people sit the whole day. Just walking, maybe brisk walking, and exercise like opening overhead cupboards. So that speaks to like activities of daily living, so it's functional. I wouldn't like jumping up and down. I'm not young anymore, and maybe I can attest to that as well. Not young anymore, so you need to look after yourself. And they want us to be fit, but there's no place to get fit. That's my biggest concern. And Professor Torres was obviously instrumental in collecting this data as well. On a positive note, guys, a recent systematic review and meta-analysis states that walking for around 7,000 steps per day can decrease mortality and other disease outcomes. So even if you walk 2,000 to 4,000 steps per day, for example, walking around the block, again, walking to get a coffee, walking back to your office, can have real benefits. So where there's a bit of a dip and an inflection point, it's around 7,000 steps, which means that we need to reconsider the 10,000 step guideline. So there are further gains from 10,000 to 12,000 steps, but those gains flatten. The 7,000 steps is reachable for the majority of us in low and middle income countries. And it can be acceptable, but it's something that we need to test in the field. the 7,000 steps versus the 10,000 steps. Hot off the press. In fact, I don't even have access to this paper. I've only got access to the abstract and the figure that came along with it. It's new evidence which shows that short movement bouts of less than 5 minutes can have positive health implications. And when you move the bouted exercise further up, you have obvious greater impact against cardiovascular disease in the long run. And that's the key message for low and middle income countries such as ours. You don't need to do the long workouts in the gym anymore. So small and frequent movements, and we call it snacking, exercise snacking, can have big health gains in the long run. And maybe that's a message for me, that I don't need to do the 300 kilometers per week to get the gains. Guys, doesn't this look beautiful? I mean, I was looking for something to package. This is for me, it's a highlight of the season. It also means that we are ripe for change. And what I want to do, and this is me shifting into my closing portion, it's around packaging and examples of some of the work we've done where we've seen positive impact in our own setting. And in terms of different settings, in the workplace, in the community, in terms of physical activity and exercise, having an obvious impact on disease outcomes. So at baseline, in all of these settings, they all look similar. Whether in a workplace, whether in a community, whether you're rural or urban, everyone had high obesity and overweight. Central adiposity, as in waist circumference, was high. They had high metabolic risk. Sleep pattern was inadequate as well. But here are some positive outcomes. I'll start off, and this study was done right here at WITS. And we collected data, and Professor Constantino and others were involved with this study. We collected data amongst landscapers, cleaners, and security staff. At baseline, their readings were very high. So we put them into a control and randomized group. And after 12 weeks, the high intensity group and the moderate intensity group had similar outcomes in terms of a drop in body mass index and a drop in waist circumference, also a drop or improvement in systolic and diastolic blood pressures. But HIIT or high intensity exercise, and those are really, really short bouts of exercise, that emerged as being time efficient. And so verbally, we didn't collect this data, but they said they appreciated the high intensity more than the longer duration. And then when you compare the longer duration, which was 30 minutes of physical activity on a continuous basis, they had a better drop in diastolic blood pressure. So it's really up to the person what they want to get involved with. Short bouts, and it could be that you're only given 30 minutes to an hour, or after work your shift means that you walk at a more brisk of a pace to get to your public transport, which would equate to a high intensity anyway. So it doesn't need to mean that you step into a gym or facility. So this next study was done in a rural setting. All these women were employed. 49 of the 115 women were in an intervention group. And we saw great outcomes in the intervention group. Post-intervention, there was a drop in blood pressure and BMI. So moderate to vigorous physical activity improved slightly, but not significantly. And then there was a very slight drop in sitting time, and that was after a 3-month supervised walking intervention. which means that even modest exercise or modest movements, such as walking, can have measurable health gains. So if we continue with it, we'd like to see what the pattern was over a longer period of time. This study is work that was in large part, driven by Dr. Merlin Paswana as part of her own PhD work, and also done here at Wits. We saw that after 3 months of a sit-to-stand study, we saw a drop in blood pressure and an improvement in light physical activity. However, most markers at the 3-month mark did remain unchanged. And that includes BMI, weight, etc. We also collected point of care, HbA1c, and glucose, and those remained the same. So this indicates it's an environmental change, such as a change in a sit-stand desk. So just imagine a desk like this in your office, or like what is depicted in the picture. It's what we introduced into people's work environments. Was not seen as the silver bullet, but it could act as a nudge in terms of a change in behavior pattern. This study was conducted during COVID. In fact, this particular person, so this is a case study, was repatriated from the Saudi region and was expected to be in quarantine for a 2-week period. I engaged with her, rapidly received ethical clearance for this study. And so they participated with exercise using online YouTube videos. And I didn't interact that much. I mean, in terms of nudging, I just said, do you want to capture your movements during this period? And they did. And their effort ranged from 62 to 81%. Body mass did not change, at all. And they had access to a weight scale. Blood pressure did not change at all. But on a positive note, the quality of life improved significantly. And specifically, and using the SF36, so at baseline and after 2 weeks, physical and emotional domains improve in terms of quality of life, which means, and this is a case study, guys, so perhaps physical activity, and it does relate to earlier evidence that physical activity can have positive outcomes in terms of your mental health status, even in confinement. Guys, this is where I land. And so I've spoken about the evidence. It's not the whole picture. It's enough to tell you that obesity is an issue. It's an existing issue. It's been an issue in the country, in our region for many, many years. It's worsened rapidly over time. We've engaged at policy, we've engaged at the highest levels of the country. But we've got the policy, the NDP policies, lots of policies, but they don't reach. They don't reach the cities and municipalities. So there is an obvious disconnect between the two. We need to do something about it as those on the ground, as researchers, as the public, because little has been done by those in power. So I'll ask you to reflect on these questions and think about this as you walk away from this presentation. What does movement look like for you in your own space? Think about gardening, for example. Could be gardening. I love gardening. Commuting, childcare. What stops you from moving? Is it time? Is it energy? Is it the space? Well, we've shown that even in confinement, you can be active. That was a 4x4 room with limited movement outside. It was policed. So there's a lot we can do without having access to gym or fitness facilities. If you could change one thing in your environment or in your life to support movement, what would that be? Guys, our city is broken. Very recently, the journalists have reflected on this, seeing Johannesburg as the worst place for walking. Our pavements are broken, guys. Our green space is there, but it's no longer green. What can we do as a people on the ground to change that? We can change our communities from the bottom up. So my final exit, be lekker. And together we can turn the evidence that's obvious into action and shape a healthier and better future for African women and for ourselves in this country. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Philippe. There you have it. You've been challenged, and yet you're still sitting down. I think on behalf of the university, I would like to present Philippe with a small symbolic gift. Thank you very much for a very personal inaugural lecture. Looking at your journey and sharing with us what it's been like as an academic, as well as a person who practices physical activity. And we're sorry that the effects of it are a little bit sore today.
Thank you so much for Can you take this one?
You can go ahead. I'll carry it for you.
Thanks.
I wanted to see how you would do that.
Thank you.
Just quickly. Once again, thank you very much, Philippe. It looks like a short time, but it's long and short for you to achieve all that in this time. Well done. But I shouldn't do what Nigel is going to do. So let me introduce Professor Nigel Crowther. Nigel obtained a BSc Honours in Biochemistry in 1985 and a PhD in 1990, both at the University of Sussex in England. In 1995, after 5 years as a postdoctoral scientist in the Department of Clinical Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge, he took up a joint Wits NHLS post in the Department of Chemical Pathology. He is now a principal medical scientist and was promoted to research professor in February 2016. He has published over 203 research articles and has acted as a supervisor and co-supervisors of 29 PhDs, of which Philippe is one of them, and 16 master's students. His research focuses on obesity-associated cardiometabolic diseases and adipose tissue biology. He received the Wits Vice-Chancellor's Research Award in 2003. Welcome to the podium, Nigel. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Philippe was one of my PhD students, hence my grey hair and also the fact that I'm bald. So this is actually quite a stressful event for me. Philippe said I look nervous, and I am nervous. I'm nervous because I'm not wearing a T-shirt, I have to wear a shirt, and I have to wear this awful red robe, and it just makes me very nervous. So I'm going to thank Philippe for three things, actually. First, I'd like to thank him for showing that West Bromwich Albion insignia on one of my photographs. So West Brom is the team I support, And so that brings me to football, and I can now commiserate with all those Liverpool supporters in the room, because I know you're going through a very hard time. And it must really infuriate you that Man United are moving up the table, but there you go. Such is life. First of all, secondly, I'd like to thank the audience for attending this evening. I mean, it's really important that we show our appreciation of our colleagues and the work that they've done, and I think your attendance at the talk this evening shows that appreciation, so I'd like to thank you all for being here. I once again would like to thank Philippe for an excellent talk. We now know that cardiometabolic disease is taking the lives of more people than infectious diseases in South Africa at this point in time. So this really emphasises the importance of the sort of work that Philippe is doing at the moment. His talk also shows that it's very important to look at not only physical activity that is done in the gym or as a sport, but also physical activity we do as part of our daily routine, and measuring this and showing that it is associated with a reduced risk of cardiometabolic disease is important, especially in the context of South Africa. I think it's also interesting to look at what Philippe did was to look at the socio-cultural relationships and how they affect how people look upon their body fat distribution. And this is very important when we're doing interventions, body weight loss interventions. We have to take this into account. So for populations in South Africa, every community, we have to look at these interrelationships to make sure our interventions are important. And I think Philippe's talk shows this. I would also like to point out, Philippe also already said this, that he supervised over 100 postgraduate students. We all know that supervising postgraduate students is a major effort, and the fact that after supervising so many students, Philippe is still charming and calm and collected shows he must be very resilient. I'd also, from a personal standpoint, like to say that I supervised Philippe's PhD study, and I've now watched him grow from a postgraduate student to a full professor. So it's been a pleasure to watch him progress, and this talk obviously shows that he fully deserves the promotion. Lastly, I would like to thank Philippe again for the talk. I have to comment on the injury. I cannot leave this room without commenting on the fact that Philippe broke his ankle whilst playing piggy in the middle with his children in the rain. I mean, so this, I've told many people, physical activity is dangerous for you. And this really shows that this is true. One should not undertake unsupervised amateur athletic events. It's dangerous. So that's a warning to the audience, please. So at this point, I think I should bring my speech to a close, and I think I'll hand over to Professor Cooper, who will bring this section of the evening to a close. Thank you. I also need to thank Philippe for being a friend.
Thank you very much, Prof. Crowther, for your insights, but more specifically for a very personalized vote of thanks again, and I think that that's really appreciated. Of course, as a Liverpool supporter myself, we look forward to seeing West Brom in the Premier League at some point, and so... colleagues, you know, I'm a psychoanalytically trained psychologist, and I get to do a lot of these things. But I have to say that it's a great way to spend an evening, listening to your colleagues who've put in many years of toil and labor into something that they've really loved doing. And so it's fantastic to be able to share in that with you this evening, Philippe, and really a big thank you to you. Thank you for your considered, your thoughtful, and your thought-provoking insights. That's also, at the same time, very personal and intellectually rigorous. At this point, we normally say, once the professor professes, there are no questions. It's the only time that you don't get a question, Philippe. So we're going to leave it there. But before we do anything else, I would want to ask for another round of applause for our inaugurating professor. This does conclude the formal part of the evening's proceedings. I'd like again to take the opportunity to thank Prof. Krather, Prof. Mjezwa, Prof. Gradidge, all of you for attending, those of you who are in the room, those of you who are online. Really fantastic to see so many of you here to celebrate this evening with us. I'm going to call it at this point. This really does conclude the evening. Can I ask you please to rise? Once the academic procession leaves the venue, I invite you to join us all in the foyer for some light refreshments, a chit-chat, and with that I declare this inaugural lecture closed. Thank you.